Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, and let me set that to the side. It's been an eventful morning. Sorry I'm getting this first video up a little later. Was a little incident with a neighbor having a fire. We saw the smoke coming out. I had to go call 911. Their dogs are safe. Everything's good. They still haven't come home. Apparently some of my neighbors left their stove on. But that being said, it's time to answer a question, and this is going to be an interesting one. I had a subscriber ask something, and I'll flip it in here. And he says, Jason, surely the deadlift is an exception here due to the lower back being the limiting factor. I can overload my forearms, grip, traps, lats, at least some of my posterior chain, maybe my legs, definitely my glutes, by lifting a heavier weight from 3 inches higher. So my question, is there a practical reason to tax your lower back with a heavy deadlift beyond a certain point? Okay, some strength is required, but say I can deadlift 450 for reps, pull near 400 from a 3-inch deficit, but have tweaked my back a dozen or more times trying to progress. Form is good, numerous coaches have said so. Could I do any harm to my physique if I only ever deadlifted that sort of weight and purely worked on progression with the trap bar, high handle trap bar, medium height block pulls? I'm getting towards 50 years old, by the way, and have no intention of competing. All right, guys, this is going to be one of those times where I say there are exceptions to certain rules. But I do want to make something very, very clear here. This overload thing, because I'm going to actually say he's right in this case. 50-year-old guy who's tweaking his lower back doing conventional deadlifts or doing definitely deficits. If he can deficit 400, fine with good form, but he's still tweaking his back. Okay, there's some mobility issues with his back. He's gotten older. There's probably some old back injuries he's dealing with. I mean, that's a different topic. I'm going to say, in that case, it might be okay to reduce the range of motion. You know what? But normally when I say these other things, I'm talking about healthy young men. And I don't mean you guys are like, oh yeah, man, I hurt my back. You're like 22 and you're talking about your hurt back. Unless you've got a doctor who's confirmed that, I don't want to hear that nonsense. But older guys, yeah, maybe so, because if something has happened, there's some integrity with his spine. But this whole idea of overloading, this is nonsense. I don't know why people come up with this idea. All right. By overloading, do you mean the same amount of load you get with a deficit deadlift? Because you will get almost as much on some of these muscles with the heavier weight. But what you need to understand, this concept that people call overload, they keep acting like you have the ability to work a muscle harder because you put it through a partial range of motion with a heavier weight. You're not overloading more weight on the muscle. You're overloading more weight on your bones. The muscles are not being overloaded more. It is physically impossible for a muscle to contract harder just because you go to a shorter range of motion with a heavier weight. The muscle is not being overloaded. By overload, meaning you're talking about working the muscle harder. It doesn't work that way. That's a complete myth. It's based upon not understanding physics and not understanding biomechanics. You have reduced overload on a muscle. Say what? You have reduced overload on a muscle. It is not getting the same amount of potential tension when you start cutting out the hardest range of motion and adding weight. You're actually putting a less total tension on the muscle. And it has to do with the moment arms and the levers. In other words, if you're able to lift 500 pounds through a shorter range of motion, then you can only lift 300 pounds through a full range of motion. You're not putting more tension on the muscle. The muscle's not working harder because you have moment arms of that. The amount of leverage on the muscle, the tension it's getting is the same, or else you wouldn't be able to lift the 500. You're using your bones and everything as levers and moment arms. You're in a favorable position. The muscles are not working harder. And that needs to be made clear over and over and over. People need to understand that. In fact, you have less potential for overload because you don't have access to as many muscle fibers because you've shortened the range of motion. So no, you're actually working most of those muscles less by doing this. Now, that being said, can you still get good stimulation? Yeah, you can still get good stimulation. That's what people need to understand. When we start talking about maximally stimulating a muscle versus just really good stimulation, the differences are pretty small in development. And at 50 years old, you're probably not concerned with, can I build every last gram of muscle that I can squeeze out in my glutes and hamstrings or my lats, before I turn 55. You're probably not going to notice a difference in the mirror, even though it will be less total potential for growth. Now, all of that being said, the overload thing is nonsense. You're not overloading them anymore. You're overloading them potentially less, even with a heavier weight. But I digress. Back to the point about the lower back thing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have some herniations and things, some damage to your lower back, your spinal erectors, you're losing mobility as you age, and you can no longer do, the first thing I would cut out is deficit deadlifts. The first thing I would say, I like deficit deadlifts. Not everyone is built to deficit deadlift, and particularly a lot of older lifters are not built to deficit deadlift. That's the first thing I would cut out. Yeah, absolutely. Great exercise, not everyone can do it safely. That's just facts. And again, it has to do with potential strain on the lower back. So cut the deficits out. And if you're still getting tweaked with a conventional, then you may need to go to a trap bar. If you're still the trap bar, because again, you're going to take some of that force off the lower back, right? You're not going to have as much flexion in the lumbar on a trap bar. That's the reason it is used for a lot of types of athletes. That's one of the things that makes it really good. It makes it a slightly less of a hinge and slightly more of a squat, just slightly. And that may be enough to stop you from getting the lower back strains. If you're still getting them with the hex bar, you might need to go to a high handle hex bar. Like you said, you might need to go to block pulls. And if that's what you have to do as an older lifter, then that's what you have to do. I would rather you adjust your range of motion to what you can safely do and still deadlift than to not deadlift at all. So yeah, I mean, if you have to reduce the range of motion because of back pain, because of old injuries that you've accumulated through life, and maybe not even an older guy, you know, some of you guys might have got hurt in a car wreck. Maybe you were in the military, you got run over and thrown out of planes and all that stuff that happens. You know, maybe you had other things happen in your life that has caused some lower back trauma to where you can't rehab it, you can't do the full range of motion on a deadlift, then so be it. Work with what you've got. Work with what you can do safely. That's okay. So when I talk about these partials, I'm talking about healthy, young, athletic men who are pretending like they're getting some benefit out of it when it's actually giving them less results, right? It's inferior stimulation. But it lets them use their ego and lift a heavier weight, and that's what it's all about. It's less stimulation. That's when I knock this stuff and say, no, that's BS. I understand that there's a difference, and it doesn't matter what the exercise is. There are other exercises to where, you know, your range of motion can be compromised due to calcium deposits, inflammation, injuries, right? That happens as we get older. You have to work around those things the best that you can. But make sure that you're being honest with yourself, because I mean, a bench press is a perfect example of one where people BS on that. It's because they don't know how to bench press. They're having problems at the bottom. They're using a bad bar path, or they don't have strong rear delts. You know, they haven't built all the stabilization they need correctly because they're trying to maybe ego lift, or again, not knowing the proper bar path or how to bench. But things like the deadlift are a little bit different of a beast because of the flexion of the spine involved. And there are going to be some people, particularly older people or people with back injuries, who may not be able to do the full range of motion. And if worst case you have to go to a high handle trap bar, by all means do so. By all means do so. But I am going to recommend that you not max out on a high handle trap bar. And the reason for that is kind of what we've covered with some of the rack pulls and everything. If you are old enough that you're suffering back issues, that you've got to reduce the range of motion by doing something like that a lot of people can pull 100, 200, maybe more pounds on a high handle trap bar than they can on a regular barbell. You also need to consider that if you start trying to go too heavy on it, you're suffering from other injuries and you're putting a lot of extra compressive force on an already damaged back. You may not be getting any shear stress, but you're putting compression on an already damaged back that might be 200 pounds heavier than you're capable of deadlifting normally. And that can have its own consequences also. So that's the other factor to consider there. So just keep that in your thoughts when you're doing that. But yeah, I mean, I would rather someone high handle trap bar deadlift than not deadlift at all. I mean, realistically, if you've got to work around what you have as far as injuries or degeneration or whatever else, then do what you're capable of doing. I mean, hopefully that's common sense for people. But as long as you understand that it is not going to give the same total potential results, even though you might be lifting more weight. And remember that lifting the more weight on it carries its own degree of risks of injury that are separate. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.